In October 22, 1989, an 11-year-old boy grabbed his bicycle and rode off to rent a movie before bedtime. Minutes later, a masked stranger emerged from the darkness, pointed a gun at 3 frightened children. In a matter of seconds, childhood innocence gave way to unimaginable heartbreak. 2 terrified boys were ordered to run for their lives and stole one of them into the night. That little boy was Jacob Wetterling, and his family would not know what became of him for the next 27 years. As hundreds of volunteers searched through forests, fields, and roadside ditches, Jacob's parents were forced to confront every family's worst nightmare, waiting for a child who never came home. But the greatest shock wasn't that Jacob disappeared without a trace. It was that the truth remained hidden for nearly 3 decades, despite countless investigations, thousands of leads, and one suspect who had crossed investigators' path years before. How could a child vanish so completely? And what buried secret kept America waiting 27 years for the answer? There are some nights that divide history into 2 chapters, before and after. For the small town of St. Joseph, Minnesota, October 22, 1989, was one of those nights. It began with 3 boys riding their bicycles home after renting a movie. A scene so ordinary that no one could have imagined it would become one of America's most haunting mysteries. By the time the night was over, 1 child had vanished, 2 young witnesses were left carrying memories they would never forget, and an entire nation had begun asking a question that would remain unanswered for nearly 27 years. Before we continue, if you're someone who believes every victim deserves to have their story remembered, take a second to subscribe. Every week, we uncover forgotten cases, expose chilling mysteries, and revisit investigations that refuse to be buried. Together, we make sure these stories are never forgotten. Now, let's get back to Jacob's story. Jacob Wetterling was only 11 years old. He wasn't running away. He wasn't breaking rules. He wasn't wandering into danger. He was simply enjoying the kind of freedom millions of American children experienced during the late 1980s. A quick bike ride with friends through familiar roads, in a community where neighbors looked out for one another, and parents believed their children would always make it home before bedtime. But on one lonely stretch of road, that comforting belief collided with a terrifying reality. As darkness settled over central Minnesota, a masked man emerged from the shadows and stopped the 3 boys at gunpoint. Moments later, he made a chilling decision that would echo across generations. He ordered 2 of the boys to run without looking back, and took Jacob with him. Those few seconds would forever alter the lives of Jacob's family, the surviving boys, the investigators who spent decades searching for answers, and countless parents across the United States, who suddenly saw familiar neighborhoods through a different lens. The disappearance sparked one of the largest missing child investigations in Minnesota's history. Thousands of volunteers searched fields, forests, and roadsides. Law enforcement agencies pursued thousands of leads. Every reported sighting, every anonymous tip, and every possible suspect was carefully examined. Yet despite extraordinary efforts, Jacob seemed to disappear without leaving behind the answers investigators desperately needed. The longer the mystery endured, the more one unsettling question took hold. How could a child vanish so completely? As the years passed, hope and heartbreak existed side by side. Jacob's parents refused to let their son's name fade from public memory, transforming unimaginable grief into advocacy for missing children and safer communities. Their determination inspired legislative reforms, national awareness campaigns, and a movement dedicated to protecting children. Yet behind every public appearance, every interview, and every anniversary remained the same deeply personal longing: to know what happened to their son, and, one day, bring him home. The investigation itself became a story of persistence, missed opportunities, evolving forensic science, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Detectives retired while new investigators picked up the case. Evidence was revisited. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Advances in DNA technology opened doors that had once seemed permanently closed. Still, the case resisted resolution, becoming one of the most recognized cold cases in modern American history. Then, nearly 27 years after Jacob disappeared, a single breakthrough shattered decades of silence. It revealed not only the identity of the man responsible, but also a series of investigative twists that would spark difficult conversations about justice, plea agreements, and whether uncovering the truth sometimes requires painful legal compromises. For many, the answers finally arrived, but so did new questions about the price of closure. Before we examine the investigation that captivated the nation, we must first meet the boy at the heart of this story. Because before Jacob Wetterling became the face of one of America's most enduring cold cases, he was simply a son, a brother, a teammate, and a friend, whose ordinary life was interrupted in the most unimaginable way. Before Jacob Wetterling's name became known across the United States, he was simply an 11-year-old boy with a contagious smile and a future filled with possibilities. To his family, he wasn't the subject of headlines or nationwide searches. He was a son who loved to laugh, a protective older brother, and the kind of child whose presence could brighten a room without demanding attention. In the quiet town of St. Joseph, Minnesota, Jacob represented the innocence of childhood that so many families believed would always be protected. Born on February 17, 1978, Jacob grew up in a home where kindness, responsibility, and respect for others were everyday values. His parents, Jerry and Patty Wetterling, encouraged curiosity, independence, and compassion. They wanted their children to enjoy the freedom of growing up in a close-knit community while understanding the importance of looking out for one another. Like countless American families, they believed they were raising their children in a place where neighbors cared. Doors were often left unlocked, and children could safely ride their bikes until the streetlights came on. Jacob was naturally adventurous, but never reckless. Friends remembered him as dependable and thoughtful, a boy who enjoyed including others rather than standing in the spotlight himself. He loved sports, especially baseball and hockey, and embraced the teamwork and discipline they required. Whether he was practicing with teammates or spending time outdoors, Jacob approached life with enthusiasm and quiet confidence. Teachers described him as respectful and eager to learn, while classmates remembered someone who was easy to talk to and quick to offer help when it was needed. Family was at the center of Jacob's world. He shared a close bond with his younger brother Trevor, often taking on the role of a caring older sibling. Their home was filled with the familiar routines that define childhood: homework after school, family dinners, weekend activities, and conversations about dreams for the future. There was nothing extraordinary about these moments, and that was precisely what made them so precious. They reflected the everyday experiences millions of families cherish, often without realizing how fragile those ordinary moments can be. The town of St. Joseph embodied the image of small-town America in the late 1980s. Located among farmland and quiet country roads, it was a place where people recognized familiar faces at local stores, attended community events together, and trusted one another. Parents rarely worried when their children biked to a friend's house or stopped by a convenience store for a snack or movie rental. Independence wasn't viewed as dangerous. It was considered part of growing up. That sense of trust shaped Jacob's childhood. Like many children of his generation, he had the freedom to explore his surroundings with friends, learning responsibility one small adventure at a time. A bike ride wasn't a source of anxiety, it was a symbol of independence. Looking back today, it's difficult to imagine how different that era was from the world many parents navigate now. Yet in 1989, very few families imagined that an evening bike ride through familiar roads could end in tragedy. Patty Wetterling often spoke about Jacob's warm personality and his ability to make people feel comfortable. She remembered him as a boy who cared deeply about others, someone who naturally looked after younger children and valued friendships. Those memories would later become a source of strength during the family's long search for answers. Instead of allowing Jacob to be remembered only for the way his life ended, they worked tirelessly to ensure he would also be remembered for the way he lived. In the years that followed Jacob's disappearance, the Wetterling family transformed unimaginable grief into advocacy. Rather than retreat from public life, they chose to help other families facing similar nightmares. Patty Wetterling became one of the nation's most recognized voices for child protection, supporting missing children, promoting prevention education, and working alongside lawmakers to improve public safety. Their efforts eventually contributed to lasting changes in how the United States responds to child abductions and protects vulnerable children. But none of that advocacy existed on the evening of October 22, 1989. On that Sunday, Jacob was simply looking forward to spending the rest of the weekend with his brother and a friend after renting a movie. It was a routine outing that had been repeated countless times before. The roads were familiar, the destination was close, and there was every reason to believe the boys would be home within minutes. What no one realized was that the peaceful routine of that evening was about to intersect with someone who had already demonstrated deeply troubling behavior in the region. In hindsight, investigators would uncover warning signs that, while alarming, had not yet been connected in a way that revealed the danger lurking nearby. As the sun disappeared below the Minnesota horizon, 3 bicycles rolled away from a neighborhood convenience store, completely unaware that they were riding toward one of the most consequential moments in American true crime history. On a Sunday morning in October 22, 1989, just like countless autumn weekends in central Minnesota, families attended church services, children spent the afternoon outdoors, and the crisp fall air signaled that winter was only weeks away. In St. Joseph, life moved at its usual unhurried pace. There was no major event, no public warning, and no indication that this ordinary Sunday would soon become one of the darkest days in the state's history. As evening approached, Jacob Wetterling met up with his younger brother Trevor and their family friend Aaron Larson. Like many boys their age, they wanted to make the most of the final hours of the weekend before school resumed the next morning. They decided to ride their bicycles to Tom Thumb convenience store, a short distance from home, to rent a movie. It was a familiar trip along roads they had traveled many times before. For their parents, there was little reason to worry. The route was known, the destination was close, and the boys were expected back within minutes. Inside the store, everything appeared perfectly normal. The boys browsed the movie selection, chatted casually, and completed their rental before beginning the ride home. Surveillance technology was limited in 1989, and there was nothing to suggest anyone inside the store noticed them being followed or watched. Witnesses later recalled seeing the boys leave together, laughing and talking as they mounted their bicycles for the short journey back. The route home took them along County Road 75, before turning onto quieter rural roads leading toward Jacob's neighborhood. The night had grown darker, and traffic was light. The 3 boys rode in close proximity, enjoying the freedom that was common for children growing up in small-town America during that era. They had no reason to believe anyone else was paying attention to them. Unknown to the boys, investigators would later examine whether the offender had selected his target in advance or encountered them by chance. That question became one of the investigation's earliest mysteries. Some detectives believed the offender may have been driving through the area, looking for an opportunity. Others considered whether he had knowledge of local roads that allowed him to choose an isolated location where there would be few witnesses. Despite years of investigation, no definitive evidence established exactly when or how the offender first encountered the boys. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they also began reviewing reports of suspicious encounters that had occurred in nearby communities before Jacob's disappearance. Several incidents involved a masked individual approaching or attempting to intimidate children in rural areas. One of the most significant occurred earlier in 1989, when a 12-year-old boy named Jared Shirel was abducted near Cold Spring, Minnesota, roughly 10 miles from where Jacob would later disappear. Jared survived and provided investigators with valuable information about his attacker. At the time, however, authorities could not conclusively connect that crime to Jacob's disappearance. Years later, advances in forensic DNA analysis would establish that the same man was responsible for Jared's abduction. Investigators would look back on those earlier reports with renewed understanding, recognizing patterns that had not been fully appreciated during the original investigation. These revelations did not suggest negligence on the part of every investigator involved. Rather, they reflected the limitations of forensic science, information sharing, and investigative technology available in the late 1980s. As the 3 boys continued their ride home, they reached a stretch of road bordered by trees and open fields. The area was quiet, with few homes nearby and limited traffic after dark. It was the kind of peaceful rural landscape that residents associated with safety rather than danger. Yet its isolation also meant that if something went wrong, there might be no one close enough to see it happen. Back at home, the Wetterling family expected Jacob to return soon. The outing had been routine, and there was nothing unusual about the boys being away for a short time. No one was watching the clock with growing concern. No frantic phone calls had been made. The evening still felt ordinary, but on that lonely stretch of road, someone else was waiting. Within moments, an armed, masked stranger would step out of the darkness and confront the boys. The decisions made over the next few minutes would trigger one of the largest missing child investigations in American history, challenged law enforcement for nearly 3 decades, and ultimately changed the way the nation approached child safety forever. The boys had almost reached home. The road ahead was familiar. Their bicycles rolled steadily through the cool October night, illuminated only by scattered porch lights and the faint glow of the moon. It was just after 9 p.m. The weekend was coming to an end, and by the next morning they would be back in school, likely talking about the movie they had rented only minutes earlier. Then everything changed. Without warning, a masked man stepped from the darkness and into the roadway. He was carrying a revolver. The stranger ordered the 3 boys to stop, get off their bicycles, and lie face down on the ground. Frightened and confused, they complied. In later interviews, the surviving boys described how the man appeared calm and deliberate rather than frantic. He spoke with authority, as though he had already decided exactly what he was going to do. The masked man began asking questions. One by one, he asked the boys their ages. The answers mattered. Jacob was 11. Trevor was 10. Aaron was 11. After a tense pause, the man made a decision that would haunt the surviving boys for the rest of their lives. He ordered Trevor and Aaron to get up, run, and never look back. Terrified, they obeyed. Neither boy knew whether Jacob was still behind them. Neither dared to turn around. They ran as fast as they could toward the nearest home, desperate to find help. Within minutes, frightened adults were calling law enforcement, and what had begun as an ordinary Sunday evening instantly became a missing child emergency. Deputies from the Stearns County Sheriff's Office responded almost immediately. As officers secured the area, they found the boys' bicycles abandoned along the roadside. There were no obvious signs revealing where Jacob had been taken. The isolation of the location, the darkness, and the absence of reliable eyewitnesses meant investigators were beginning with very little physical evidence. Word spread quickly through St. Joseph. Neighbors left their homes carrying flashlights. Farmers searched their fields. Friends, relatives, firefighters, and volunteers gathered through the night, refusing to believe an 11-year-old could simply disappear without a trace. Search teams combed nearby woods, drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, and open farmland. Helicopters flew overhead while trained search dogs attempted to follow Jacob's scent. By sunrise, the operation had expanded dramatically. The FBI joined local authorities. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension became involved. The Minnesota National Guard assisted with extensive searches. Hundreds of volunteers soon became thousands. Roadblocks were established. Interviews began almost immediately. Investigators examined every possible route leading away from the scene, hoping someone had noticed a suspicious vehicle or an unfamiliar person. Tips poured in from across Minnesota and eventually from around the country. Every telephone call carried the possibility of being the breakthrough everyone desperately hoped for. But as days turned into weeks, optimism slowly gave way to uncertainty. Investigators followed thousands of leads. Some reports claimed Jacob had been seen in neighboring states. Others suggested he had been taken by someone passing through the area. Several individuals became persons of interest over the years, only to be eliminated after careful investigation. Witnesses were re-interviewed. Composite sketches were revised. Search warrants were executed. Yet every promising lead eventually reached another dead end. The lack of forensic evidence proved to be one of the investigation's greatest obstacles. The offender had struck quickly, left little behind, and disappeared before anyone could identify him. In 1989, DNA technology was still in its infancy. Investigators simply did not have the scientific tools that would later revolutionize criminal investigations. Cases that today might be solved through sophisticated forensic analysis often remained unsolved for years because those technologies did not yet exist. As the 1990s passed, Jacob's case became one of America's most recognized missing child investigations. His photograph appeared on television broadcasts, newspaper front pages, billboards, and missing child campaigns nationwide. Each anniversary renewed public attention, but despite the increased awareness, the central mystery remained unchanged. Where was Jacob Wetterling? And who had taken him? Behind the scenes, investigators continued reviewing evidence, comparing similar crimes, and preserving every piece of information they believed might someday become important. They refused to close the file, convinced that the answer still existed somewhere within the thousands of pages of reports and evidence collected over the years. That persistence finally began to pay off decades later. Advances in DNA testing allowed investigators to revisit an earlier crime involving 12-year-old Jared Shirel, who had survived an abduction months before Jacob disappeared. Biological evidence from that case identified a man named Danny Heinrich. Detectives quickly realized Heinrich had been interviewed during the original Jacob Wetterling investigation in 1989, but had never been charged due to insufficient evidence. The discovery reopened every question investigators thought they understood. Federal agents obtained a search warrant for Heinrich's property. During the search, they recovered evidence that led to federal child pornography charges, giving prosecutors lawful leverage they had never previously possessed. Faced with overwhelming federal evidence and years of mounting investigative pressure, Heinrich entered negotiations that would ultimately reshape the entire case. Those negotiations would lead to one of the most controversial plea agreements in modern American criminal justice. For some, it represented the only path to discovering the truth. For others, it came at an unbearable cost. The nation was finally about to learn what happened to Jacob Wetterling, but whether justice would truly be served would become a question almost as difficult as the mystery itself. For nearly 27 years, investigators pursued every credible lead they could find. Detectives came and went. New technologies emerged. Old evidence was reviewed again and again. Yet one question remained painfully unanswered. What happened to Jacob Wetterling? The breakthrough did not begin with a murder charge, but what investigators discovered next would shock an entire community. Before we continue, if you believe every victim deserves to have their story remembered, consider subscribing. It began with science. By the early 2010s, forensic DNA analysis had advanced dramatically beyond what was possible in 1989. Investigators revisited evidence from the January 1989 abduction of 12-year-old Jared Shirel, a boy who had survived an attack near Cold Spring, Minnesota, just months before Jacob disappeared. Modern DNA testing identified Danny Heinrich as Jared's attacker, giving investigators their strongest lead in decades. Ironically, that DNA identification could not be used to prosecute Heinrich for Jared's abduction because the statute of limitations for the applicable offenses had already expired before the DNA evidence identified him. While many serious crimes, such as murder, generally have no statute of limitations under Minnesota law, some other offenses at the time were subject to legal filing deadlines. That legal reality frustrated investigators and the public alike, but it did not end the investigation into Jacob's disappearance. With Heinrich now firmly in their sights, investigators sought additional evidence. In 2015, federal agents executed a lawful search warrant at his residence. During that search, they recovered child sexual abuse material, leading federal prosecutors to charge Heinrich with possession of child pornography under federal law. Unlike the decades-old disappearance case, these federal charges were supported by current physical evidence and provided prosecutors with immediate legal leverage. At first glance, some members of the public questioned why federal authorities appeared to focus on child pornography rather than Jacob's disappearance. In reality, prosecutors often pursue charges that can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt while continuing to investigate more serious crimes. This strategy is well established in American criminal law and allows investigators to maintain lawful custody of a suspect while gathering additional evidence. As Heinrich faced federal prosecution, negotiations began between his defense attorneys and the United States Attorney's Office. These discussions centered on a difficult question that had troubled investigators for decades. Would the truth ever be known if Heinrich chose to remain silent? The prosecution faced significant evidentiary challenges. There were no eyewitnesses who had seen Jacob after the abduction. There was no body. There was no murder weapon recovered. Although investigators strongly believed Heinrich was responsible, obtaining a murder conviction after nearly 3 decades without Jacob's remains would have been legally complex and carried substantial litigation risks. Federal prosecutors therefore exercised what is known as prosecutorial discretion, the authority to determine how best to pursue justice based on the available evidence. They proposed a plea agreement unlike any the public had expected. Under the agreement, Heinrich would plead guilty to the federal child pornography charge, admit under oath that he abducted and killed Jacob Wetterling, provide investigators with a complete account of what happened, personally lead investigators to Jacob's burial site. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue homicide charges related to Jacob's death. The proposal immediately generated debate. To some observers, It seemed impossible to accept that the man responsible for one of America's most heartbreaking child abductions would never stand trial for murder. Others believed that after 27 years of uncertainty, recovering Jacob's remains and finally giving his family truthful answers represented a form of justice that no courtroom battle could guarantee. Throughout this process, prosecutors remained in close communication with Jacob's parents, Patty and Jerry Wetterling. While no agreement could erase their loss, they ultimately supported the decision. Their priority had never changed. They wanted Jacob to come home. On September 1, 2016, Heinrich fulfilled a central condition of the agreement. He accompanied investigators to a pasture near Paynesville, Minnesota, where he identified the location where Jacob's remains had been buried for nearly 27 years. Investigators carefully recovered the remains, and 2 days later, dental records confirmed the identity. For the Wetterling family, the confirmation brought profound grief, but also an end to decades of agonizing uncertainty. Patty Wetterling later reflected that, despite the passage of time, she had always carried hope that Jacob might somehow still be alive. That hope ended with the recovery of his remains, but so did the painful uncertainty that had defined nearly 3 decades of waiting. Shortly afterward, Heinrich appeared in federal court and formally admitted responsibility for Jacob's abduction and death as part of his plea agreement. He also admitted abducting and sexually assaulting Jared Shirel in January 1989, a crime for which he could no longer be prosecuted because of the expired statute of limitations. His sworn confession resolved questions that investigators had pursued since the night Jacob disappeared. The federal court accepted Heinrich's guilty plea to the child pornography charge and sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison, consistent with the negotiated plea agreement. Although many people wished a murder conviction had been possible, prosecutors maintained that the agreement achieved 3 objectives that might otherwise never have been realized: a truthful confession, the recovery of Jacob's remains, and definitive answers for the family. Legal experts have continued to discuss the case as an example of the difficult balance prosecutors sometimes face between seeking the maximum possible punishment and securing the strongest attainable outcome based on available evidence. Plea agreements can be controversial, particularly in emotionally devastating cases, but they remain a lawful and long-standing component of the American criminal justice system when both sides determine that the agreement serves the interests of justice. For Patty and Jerry Wetterling, however, the courtroom proceedings were never solely about legal doctrine. They were about a little boy who had left home to rent a movie and never returned. After 27 years, Jacob was finally coming home. But while the criminal case had reached its legal conclusion, Jacob's story was far from over. His legacy would reshape national child protection laws, inspire generations of advocates, and leave behind lessons that continue to influence parents, communities, and law enforcement agencies across the United States. When the investigation finally reached its conclusion in 2016, many people assumed the Wetterling family would feel relief above all else. But grief is rarely that simple. For nearly 27 years, Jerry and Patty Wetterling had lived with 2 competing realities: the painful absence of their son and the enduring hope that he might somehow still be alive. The discovery of Jacob's remains ended the uncertainty that had defined their lives for decades, but it also marked the moment when hope gave way to the certainty of loss. In the days that followed the recovery, Patty Wetterling addressed the public with remarkable grace. Rather than allowing anger to define Jacob's legacy, she spoke about compassion, healing, and the importance of choosing hope over hatred. Her message surprised many who expected bitterness after nearly 3 decades of unanswered questions. Instead, she reminded the nation that while one individual had taken her son's life, he would not be allowed to define Jacob's life. She encouraged communities to remember Jacob for the joy he brought to others, not solely for the tragedy that ended his childhood. Jerry Wetterling echoed a similar sentiment. Throughout the investigation, he had stood beside his family during countless searches, media interviews, and anniversaries that reopened old wounds. When the truth finally emerged, he emphasized gratitude toward the investigators who never stopped working the case. Detectives from local agencies, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the FBI, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and volunteers had all contributed over the years. Although the outcome could never restore what had been lost, their persistence ensured that the truth would not remain buried forever. The case also prompted renewed reflection within the law enforcement community. investigators openly acknowledge that criminal investigations evolve alongside science and technology. In 1989, DNA analysis was limited, digital databases were far less sophisticated, and information sharing between agencies lacked many of the systems available today. By preserving evidence and continually revisiting the case, investigators were eventually able to benefit from advances that simply did not exist when Jacob disappeared. The Wetterling investigation became a powerful reminder that even the oldest cold cases can move forward when evidence is carefully maintained and new forensic methods are applied. Perhaps Jacob's greatest legacy extends far beyond the courtroom. In 1994, Congress enacted the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act, establishing the first nationwide framework requiring states to create sex offender registration programs. While the law has evolved through later legislation, it marked a significant shift in how the United States approached offender monitoring and child protection. Jacob's name became permanently associated with a nationwide effort to reduce the risk of future crimes against children. The Wetterling family also dedicated themselves to education and prevention. Through advocacy and collaboration with child protection organizations, they encouraged families, schools, and communities to have open conversations about personal safety, trusted adults, and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. Their work consistently emphasized empowerment rather than fear. Patty Wetterling often reminded parents that the goal was not to frighten children into avoiding the world, but to equip them with knowledge and confidence to navigate it safely. Jacob's story also reshaped public awareness of missing child investigations. Across the country, law enforcement agencies strengthened interagency cooperation, improved communication systems, expanded public alert strategies, and placed greater emphasis on preserving evidence for future forensic testing. While no single reform can eliminate every risk, the lessons learned from this case continue to influence investigative practices and child protection efforts today. For viewers, Jacob's story offers several enduring lessons. First, ordinary routines deserve thoughtful preparation. Most outings end exactly as expected, but discussing family safety plans, identifying trusted adults, and encouraging children to communicate openly can strengthen their confidence without taking away their independence. Second, communities matter. Jacob's disappearance demonstrated how neighbors, volunteers, first responders, and investigators can unite in extraordinary ways during a crisis. Building strong local relationships and maintaining awareness of unusual activity remain important components of community safety. Third, technology should be viewed as a tool, not a substitute, for communication. Today's families have access to mobile phones, location sharing, and emergency alert systems that were unavailable in 1989. Used responsibly, these tools can complement ongoing conversations about safety and preparedness. Finally, Jacob's case reminds us that justice is not always measured solely by the length of a prison sentence. Sometimes justice also includes uncovering the truth, recovering the missing, providing answers to grieving families, and ensuring that future generations are better protected because of what was learned. The legal outcome in this case remains the subject of thoughtful discussion, but there is little disagreement about the lasting impact Jacob's story has had on American society. Today, when people hear the name Jacob Wetterling, they remember far more than an unsolved mystery. They remember a smiling 11-year-old boy whose disappearance united a nation. They remember parents who transformed unimaginable heartbreak into a lifetime of advocacy. They remember investigators who refused to abandon a case despite decades of uncertainty. And they remember that even after 27 years, perseverance, science, and determination can still uncover the truth. If there is one message this story leaves behind, it is this: every missing child is more than a case number. Every family deserves answers, and every community has a role to play in protecting the children who trust it to keep them safe. Thank you for watching. If Jacob Wetterling's story moved you, consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this documentary to help preserve the memory of the victims whose stories deserve to be remembered, not because of how they were taken from the world, but because of the lives they lived and the lasting changes they inspired. Here is another disturbing case that totally changed how detectives approach age-long crimes that have gone cold until DNA science began unraveling the missing clue.